He was fine on a call yesterday, so I think he's still all right.
The Committee on Homeland Security will be in order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the committee in recess at any point. Good morning. Free and fair elections are the bedrock of our democracy. As we learned just over 18 months ago, democracy is not something we can take for granted. We must defend it fiercely and protect the institutions that uphold it. So I commend Chairman Thompson for allowing this important hearing on the threats to our elections. When I was first eligible to vote in 2006, election officers across the country were in the process of replacing infrastructure to defend against the greatest threat to elections in recent history, the notorious hanging Chad. Social media was new and largely a way for young college kids to connect. Our adversaries had not figured out how to weaponize our freedom of speech or our technological ingenuity and use it against us. The notion that an armed crowd would descend upon the United States Capitol to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power would have been beyond anyone's wildest imagination. And harassing election officials to alter an election result was something relegated to developing democracies or democracies in decline. But the 2006 election ushered in a new era of threats to our democracy. The Russian government targeted election infrastructure and exploited social media to spread conspiracy theories to tip the scales in favor of one candidate and, more devastatingly, begin to sow doubt among the public about the integrity of our democratic institutions. Committee Democrats recognized the urgent national security threat the Russian government had created and established an election security task force with members of the House Administration Committee to better understand the threats to elections and how to mitigate against them. Unfortunately, we did not get bipartisan support to implement the task force's recommendations, and efforts to enact them into law have languished in the Senate for 2 Congresses. In the meantime, our adversaries redoubled their efforts to sow division among us, and some desperate politicians latched onto the big lie and other conspiracy theories. As a result, 3 days after I was sworn into my first term in Congress, a violent mob stormed the Capitol, holding democracy hostage. Outside Washington, election officials have found themselves victims of harassment and threats in a way that we've never seen before. As a result, election officers across the country are struggling to retain a trained staff, exacerbating the existing challenges associated with administering the 2022 midterm elections. When we were sworn in as members of this chamber, we took an oath to protect and defend the Constitution and the democratic principles enshrined in it. It is incumbent upon all of us to understand the evolving threats to our elections and to defend against them. I look forward to the testimony today, and I thank our witnesses for their participation. Before I recognize the ranking member, on behalf of Chairman Thompson and the members of the committee, I would like to welcome Congresswoman Mayra Flores of Texas to the panel. We look forward to working with you on important matters before this committee. The chair recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Katko, for an opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, you stole my thunder because I was going to welcome Mayra Flores as well to Congress in general, but for this committee in particular, given her proximity to the southwest border, her expertise in that regard will be definitely a value add to the committee. So I want to thank you for holding this hearing today, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate our witnesses being here to discuss how we can work together to physically protect our state and local election officials while also securing election infrastructure from foreign interference and cyber threats. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, is charged by Congress with being the nation's lead civilian cybersecurity agency, and it plays a critical role in this endeavor. I look forward to our witnesses' perspectives on ways to improve the physical security of our elections, as well as the tools and services provided by CISA to shore up our election cyber defenses. They've come a long way for sure. Our committee remains committed to securing our democratically run elections from all threats, including physical threats to election workers. Following the 2020 presidential election, the Department of Justice reported more than 850 incidents of threats and harassment targeting election workers. Issues such as these will not be tolerated and can and should continue to be dealt with by local law enforcement. In recent years, foreign adversaries like Russia, Iran, and China have targeted U.S. elections both through election influence and election interference. Foreign actors seek to undermine our elections both directly by tampering with our election systems and indirectly by attempting to influence how people think about an election. Let me be clear. The United States will not allow any adversary to sow distrust or chaos in our democratic process. In addition to these foreign interference efforts, our nation is seeing a spike in cyber threats across all 16 critical infrastructure sectors, and the election infrastructure sector is no exception. Simply being vigilant is no longer enough. Today's cyber threat environment demands a posture of unwavering resilience. As we enter the 2022 elections, we must keep a keen eye on the midterms and ensure that voters can be confident that their vote will be cast securely. Given the volume and sophistication of the cyber threats we face, we must empower CISA with the tools and resources it needs to support our state and local election officials so that they can carry out their mission to administer free and fair elections. CISA's election security mission has greatly evolved since election infrastructure was designated as a subsector of our nation's critical infrastructure in 2017. CISA has gone to great lengths to build trusted relationships with state and local election officials across the country and has provided free and voluntary cybersecurity services, tools, and other guidance in all 50 states. A key part of securing election infrastructure that is owned and operated by state and local governments, not the federal government, is ensuring that CISA has the ability to provide situational awareness about vulnerabilities across digital footprints. I am pleased that we are joined today by Secretary LaRose, who as Ohio's Secretary of State serves as the state's Chief Elections Officer. The Secretary spent years working to ensure Ohio's elections are secure, and he was even named Legislator of the Year in 2016 by the Ohio Association of Election Officials for his work to improve the state's election process. I look forward to hearing from the Secretary and all our witnesses today about the practical, meaningful steps Congress can take to improve CISA's ability to support our state and local officials in protecting the cyber and physical security of our elections. Cybersecurity is indeed a team sport, and now is the time to double down. Protecting the homeland requires partnerships throughout all levels of government and across industries and party lines. Working together, we can be prepared not only for the threats of today, but also the emerging risks of tomorrow. And before I close briefly, I just want to give you one quick story. Several years ago, or 2 years ago, we had an election security task force meeting up in central New York. And we have the election officials there from the counties in my district. And one woman told me that she received 1,762 directives from the election security task force in 1 year. She shares her chief information security officer with 20-something other agencies in her county. And no one's digesting that information. That's one of the big concerns I have, and that's one of the big things we need to tackle going forward is how do we make actionable the information we're getting from the experts? And that's something that I want to hear from you, Ms. Howard, and the other witnesses today. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Other members of the committee are reminded that under committee rules, opening statements may be submitted for the record. Members are also reminded that the committee will operate according to the guidelines laid out by the chairman and ranking member in our February 3rd, 2021 colloquy regarding remote procedures. I now welcome our panel of witnesses. Our first witness, the Honorable Maggie Toulouse Oliver, has served as the Secretary of State of New Mexico since 2016. From 2007 until 2016, Secretary Toulouse Oliver served as the county clerk of Bernalillo County, where she oversaw elections in the state's largest county. Secretary Toulouse Oliver is also the past president of the National Association of the Secretaries of State. Our second witness, Mr. Neil Kelly, is the current chairman of the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections. Mr. Kelly recently retired from serving as the chief election official, the registrar of voters for Orange County, California, a role he held for over 17 years. Mr. Kelly is also a past member of the EAC Voting System Standards Board, a past founding member of the DHS Election Security Task Force, Government Coordinating Council, and a number of other organizations aimed at making elections more accessible and secure. Our third witness, Ms. Elizabeth Howard, is a senior counsel for elections and government at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU School of Law. Prior to joining the Brennan Center, Ms. Howard served as Deputy Commissioner for the Virginia Department of Elections. During her tenure, she coordinated many election administration modernization projects, including the adoption of online, paperless absentee ballot applications, for which the department received a 2017 Innovations in American Government Bright Ideas Award from the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at the Harvard Kennedy School. Our final witness, the Honorable Frank LaRose, has served as the Secretary of State of Ohio since 2019. Prior, Secretary LaRose served 2 terms in the Ohio State Senate and was named the Legislator of the Year in 2016 by the Ohio Association of Election Officials in recognition of his support and commitment to improving Ohio's election process. Without objection, the witnesses' full statements will be included in the record. The chair asks each witness to summarize their statements for 5 minutes, beginning with Secretary Toulouse Oliver.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I am very pleased to be here today with these distinguished colleagues. My name is Maggie Toulouse Oliver, and I serve as New Mexico's Secretary of State, our chief elections official. Election administration in the United States is conducted at the state, county, and local levels by civil servants who come to work every day to do their duty, keeping the engine of our democracy running. This work is not glamorous, but it is vital to how we elect our leaders and how we organize our way of life. Since 2020, however, lies and misinformation about how elections are run and about the people who run them have proliferated to an unprecedented degree. Among a significant portion of the country, the continuous drumbeat of these lies has created an atmosphere of distrust in our elections and our election officials. Many people now believe that our country's highest office is occupied by an illegitimate president. Many people now believe that our entire election infrastructure is corrupted and has been weaponized to exclusively favor one political party. Many people now believe that election administration practices that serve to increase access and security, like secured ballot drop boxes, air-gapped vote counting systems, vote by mail, and the ministerial certification of election results, to name only a few, are part of a vast conspiracy meant to undermine our entire American way of life. Of course, these things are not true, and no one has ever produced a shred of credible evidence to support these conspiratorial claims. But the consequences of these lies have real-world impacts, especially for election officials. For people who believe their government is corrupt and their leaders are not legitimate, threats of physical violence and acts of intimidation have unfortunately begun to seem like acceptable responses. In New Mexico, the conspiracies about our voting and election systems have gripped a portion of the electorate here and have caused people to take action. During the 2020 election cycle, I was doxxed and had to leave my home for weeks under state police protection. My office has since had to utilize services for both me and members of my staff that prevent doxing by removing personal identifying information from the internet. Since 2020, my office has certainly seen an uptick in social media trolling, aggrieved emails and calls into our office, and other communications that parrot the misinformation circulating widely in the national discourse. But more recently, especially since our June 22 primary election, my office has experienced pointed threats, serious enough to be referred to law enforcement. As recently as June, for example, there were 3 threatening phone calls against me that were referred to our FBI field office for investigation. These threats came on the heels of my office's effort to directly combat election misinformation through a new website, and shortly after a nationally publicized situation in Otero County, New Mexico, where the county commission, parroting much of the election misinformation we're seeing across the country, initially refused to certify the primary election results. My office then had to seek a court order to compel them to perform their duty under the law. Growing distrust about our election system leads to either apathy or indignation, both of which will have detrimental effects on our entire system of government. For the election officials and volunteer poll workers that our elections depend on, I fear that threats, coupled with the general vitriol online and in the media directed at all aspects of our elections, will cause them so much stress and uncertainty that they will simply not want to do the work anymore. We've already seen this happening in many parts of the country. For voters, I fear that the flood of misinformation will compel them to lose more and more trust in the system, and they will no longer participate in our democracy. I believe both federal and state law enforcement agencies are taking these threats seriously and diligently. We must show the public that threats against election officials will not be tolerated. Thank you again. I hope my testimony is helpful, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for your testimony. The chair recognizes Mr. Kelly to summarize his statement for 5 minutes. Mr. Kelly?
Yes, I'm sorry. Good morning, Chairman Torres, Ranking Member Kotko, and members of the Committee on Homeland Security. Thank you for the invitation to speak today at this important hearing. You rigged my election. We are going to try you and hang you. We are coming for you. There will be blood on the ballots and blood on you. These are just a small example of the type of threats and harassment election officials around the country have experienced, including myself, in recent elections. We also know that many election officials, in addition to personal threats, have also endured threats against their families. As a result, upcoming elections are not very appealing to those that run them. Many have left the profession. The impact is widespread. And while the effects on individuals are devastating, the potential blow to democracy should not be dismissed. Throughout my written testimony, I talk about the need to engage law enforcement in the election planning process. However, I must make clear that I'm not advocating for the presence of armed officers in polling places. This is a sensitive issue and one that should be handled with the seriousness that it deserves. I believe there are ways to address these growing threats while remaining steadfast in our resolve to recognize that the mere presence of law enforcement in the polls can be viewed as intimidation. There are steps that can help. As an example, while serving as Orange County's chief election official, I established a task force made up of DHS, the FBI, our state and local law enforcement partners, and our district attorney. Combining my experience as a former police officer, we worked collaboratively long before an election to plan for specific responses. This included local plainclothes investigators, pre-positioned in the field, not in polling places, reviews of all voting locations, personnel, and intelligence gathering. When we were faced with agitated observers, threats, and protests in 2020, the coordinated response was swift and effective. Amid these growing threats, I believe that we should not lose sight that elections are critical infrastructure, as mentioned by Ranking Member Kotko, which was established to support and protect the mechanics of running elections. The protection of our nation's poll workers, voters, physical locations, ballot counting centers, and voting systems, which are a part of the backbone of our democracy, should be a priority. I'd like to try and thread a needle here. I feel it's important to highlight the very essential right to observe and comment on elections, to be a part of the process, and to engage with your local election administrator. I believe in the fundamental rights that the First Amendment affords our citizens as they exercise their rights to challenge the outcome of an election. Transparency goes hand in hand with a fully audited, accurate, and fair election. These are not mutually exclusive. Nevertheless, as an election official, you know when that line has been crossed, when acts of violence, threats to oneself or family, threats to the infrastructure, interference, harassment, or intimidation begins to emerge, then the entire process is at risk. Over the past several months, a group of election officials and law enforcement personnel from across the country have been meeting to address the protection of the public servants who supervise our elections from intimidation, threats, and violence. Recently organized as the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections, of which I'm currently the chair, I mentioned at the outset, it's a group of chiefs of police, elected sheriffs, and former and current election officials nationwide coming together to close the gap between law enforcement and election administration. Our committee is focused on creating tools and developing solutions to combat this problem, such as resources, guides, and training for law enforcement and election officials, creating tools designed to build relationships among partner agencies, and looking at potential policies that might help to reduce the risk. I don't want to leave this important topic without also noting that we must continue to do work to reduce voters' lack of confidence, which can exacerbate the very issues we are discussing today. For instance, election officials should continue to expand audits, partner with prosecutors on any violations of election law, and improve the voter experience, which will continue to build trust and confidence among voters. This, of course, will not change all hearts and minds, but this is a journey without a finish line. Congress can greatly assist states and counties with these growing threats by raising awareness, increasing funding to enhance physical security of election offices, the associated infrastructure, and supporting collaboration among election officials and law enforcement partners when needed and most appropriate. Finally, in closing, our institutes of democracy are under attack, and while many election officials are resilient, it is stretching their capacity to operate while being threatened. I don't mean to overstate this, but the important act of running fair and accurate elections is what holds a fragile democracy together. We just want someone to have our backs. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. The chair recognizes Ms. Howard to summarize her statement for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Torres, Ranking Member Kakko, and members of this committee for the opportunity to speak with you today about the ever-changing election security landscape and one of the biggest concerns facing our elections today, threats against election officials. As you know, in 2017, state and local election officials were somewhat suddenly informed about the threats against our election infrastructure by foreign enemies, such as Russia and Iran, and about the types of attacks that they were now responsible for protecting our election infrastructure against. Despite being underfunded and under-resourced, our election officials are rising to the challenge. And just 5 years later, there has been a remarkable improvement in the resiliency of our election infrastructure. Today, election officials view cybersecurity as a critical component of planning for safe and secure elections. New and more secure voting equipment has been deployed across many states and many counties. Election officials have developed and practiced plans to respond to various cyber threats, such as ransomware, and many officials have taken other important steps to harden their systems against cyber attack. This significant shift would not have happened without the federal financial support specifically designated for election security that Congress has provided starting in 2018, and the federal partners, including the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency and the U.S. Election Assistance Commission that have worked closely with our election officials over the past 5 years. Also critical to the significant improvements that we see today are the election community leaders who have led by example, including the 3 other witnesses on today's panel. Ohio Secretary of State LaRose has long been a pioneer on the election and cybersecurity front, working to quickly and strategically secure Ohio's election infrastructure against attack and establishing some of the first statewide standards in the country. New Mexico's Secretary of State Toulouse Oliver has also served as an important election security leader. She was one of the first to quickly distribute the initial tranche of federal election security funding to those most in need in her state, county election officials. Neil Kelly, who as a local election official was primarily responsible for administering elections, published one of the first practical election security resources for officials, the 2018 Election Security Playbook. And while we are now on the right track to secure our election infrastructure against cyber attack, new and different threats, many with domestic roots, have arisen, including threats of physical harm to our election officials, their families, and their staff. You will effing pay for your effing lying, effing remarks. We will take you out. F you, F your family, F your life, you effer. Watch your effing back. Threats like that, left as a voicemail for a Republican election official in Michigan, were received by election officials across the country after the 2020 election and continue today. Not surprisingly, these threats are leading to additional serious concerns, such as an alarming number of election officials leaving the profession, which are contributing to the fragility of our democracy. Just as they needed your help to protect our technology, election officials now need your help to keep them, their families, and their staff safe. In the Brennan Center's 2022 election official survey, we found that more than 3/4 of election officials believe that threats against them had increased in recent years. More than half were concerned about the safety of their colleagues, and 1 in 6 election officials had been threatened. Effective mitigation strategies will require tackling not only these threats, but also the barrage of false information about our election administration and our election officials that is fueling these threats. Of course, Congress alone cannot eliminate these problems. A proper response will require a whole-of-society approach, and we all have a role to play. However, Congress can play a primary role in tackling these issues and spurring on others to do their part. For example, Congress should authorize grants specifically for physical safety training and for security enhancements to election officials' residences. Congress should also work with a number of federal departments and agencies to ensure that they are effectively working to protect our election officials, including the Departments of Homeland Security and Justice, as I have detailed in my written testimony. Thank you again for your time today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your testimony. The chair recognizes Secretary LaRose to summarize his statement for 5 minutes.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you so much, Chairman Torres and Ranking Member Katko, and really all the members of the House Homeland Security Committee. Thanks for the opportunity to submit my testimony today on the security of our elections, of course, something that we all care deeply about. First, let me set the scene for you. It's May 4th, 2021. It's primary election day in Ohio, and an individual has plugged an unauthorized laptop into a government network at the Lake County Administrative Building. He was engaging in some sort of effort to capture election data. Presumably, his hope was that he was going to discover or download some sort of election information to prove that election results can be impacted by an outside influence. I'm happy to report that that person failed, and he failed miserably. Why? Quite simply because we were prepared. Now, when I served as an Army Green Beret in the Special Forces, we learned to never let our guard down. Our lives were a constant churn of study and preparation and execution. After all, the bad guys only had to be right once. We had to be right every single day. When I was elected Secretary of State, I took that same mindset and adapted it to how we operate in Ohio. In fact, we made it our standard. So how did we stop this perpetrator on primary election day in 2021? It actually started in 2019. When I issued, as Secretary of State, our first ever security directive for all of Ohio's 88 county boards of elections. It was a checklist. I called it our pre-flight checklist for the presidential election of 2020. It was a 34-point checklist of both physical and cybersecurity requirements that were designed with one purpose: to keep the bad guys out. Now, I'll be honest, when I first announced these requirements at a meeting of all of our county boards of elections, there was a groan in the audience and even some laughter in the back. I was asking a lot of them, and many thought that it wasn't possible. But our elections are too important, and we can't sit on our hands and hope that things are going to be okay. We have to take action, and that's exactly what our county boards of elections did. From the largest, most populous and sophisticated county boards of elections in our state to the most rural county boards of elections that have been really administering elections the same way for generations, they all rolled up their sleeves, and in concert with the security professionals in our office, they got it done. That's why Ohio's bipartisan teams of elections professionals, in my opinion, are truly the best in the business. So when this individual plugged his laptop into a Lake County administrative building, what did he access? Quite simply, nothing. First of all, every single county board of elections computer system has long been siloed off from every other county office. So anyone thinking that they could use a county computer system in one county office to somehow infiltrate the county board of elections would find that they would run into an impenetrable brick wall. Second, even if they had somehow gotten into the Board of Elections building and plugged into their network, they would have immediately been blocked because that computer would have been recognized as an unauthorized user on that network. Again, game over. These are just two out of dozens of improvements that we made at our county boards of elections since 2019. Naturally, when we talk about cybersecurity, we're talking primarily about those elements of election infrastructure which are, of course, connected to the internet. We're talking about email, websites, polling location lookup functions, online voter registration, all conveniences that voters, of course, want to have access to. But it's important to emphasize that voting equipment is never connected to the internet. There's an entire separate parallel set of election infrastructure that is never connected to the internet. Quite simply, anything that touches a ballot can never be connected to the internet. That's scanners, voting machines, tabulators, all of which are very strictly air-gapped. Since our first directive, we've issued two more. Again, we can never get complacent or rest on our laurels. With the most recent one just announced last month, we call it our Security Directive 3.0. As the tactics of our enemies change and evolve, we must do the same. That's why we can't rest, and we won't rest. A comprehensive, multifaceted security strategy within our county boards of elections is necessary to provide the redundancy required for a strong election system infrastructure. We also know that our elections are only as successful as the people who run them. In 2020, we recruited a small army of dedicated patriots, Republicans, and Democrats to serve as poll workers. In the face of uncertainty amid the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, we had a record 56,789 Ohioans who stepped up, were trained, and ready to serve their communities, and they provided secure, accurate, and accessible elections, the ones which Ohio voters have, of course, become accustomed. In light of the pandemic, we knew that we had to get creative about poll worker recruitment. That's exactly what we did. We worked with a whole array of professionals and all sorts of different demographics to recruit patriotic Ohioans from across the state to help us administer an incredibly challenging election. In doing so, we stood up also an army of truth tellers who could speak firsthand about the lengths to which Ohio goes to ensure the integrity of our elections. You simply can't put a price on that. Integrity matters. That's what our elections are built on. Thomas Jefferson put it very succinctly.
Secretary LaRose, if you can conclude.
Powers. Yes, sir. Government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. And the only way that we convey that is through a free and fair election. And that's what we're going to continue to deliver in Ohio. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Look forward to your questions.
No, thank you, Secretary LaRose. I thank the witnesses for their testimony. The chair reminds each member that he or she will have 5 minutes to question the witnesses. I will now recognize myself for questions. Ms. Howard, threats to election security vary widely in the United States. There's the threat of a cyber attack on election infrastructure. There's the threat of influence operations that radicalize people with misinformation and disinformation and malinformation. And then there's the threat of violence and harassment and intimidation against election officials themselves. Of all these threats, which one, in your view, has the greatest likelihood of endangering election security in the 2020 congressional midterm elections? 2022, I apologize.
Thank you for the question. Right now, one of my biggest concerns has to do with threats against election officials, not just because of the threats against the election officials, but because of the cascading effects that result from these threats to election officials. So what we're seeing across the country are election officials who are deciding to leave the profession. So for example, 5 out of Arizona's 15 counties now have new election directors this cycle. 6 of Georgia's most populous counties have new election directors this cycle. This creates the potential for more mis and disinformation because the people taking the retiring election officials' place are not going to have the same level of experience, they're not going to know as much, and they're not going to be as prepared as those who had several years of experience who were running elections in their state and their county to combat, right, this ever-growing threat of mis, dis, and malinformation.
Ms. Howard, you noted that 1 in 6 election officials have been the target of threats. We heard from Secretary Oliver and Mr. Kelly that they themselves have been the targets of threats. And we know that former President Trump's narrative of a stolen election inspired the Stop the Steal movement, which ultimately led to the insurrection on January 6th. My question is for Mr. Kelly and Secretary Oliver, to what extent, based on your own experience, are the words and ideas of former President Donald Trump at fault for creating what seems to be an unprecedented hostile environment against election officials?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the question. I will say this, that although these types of discourse were amplified in 2020, I've heard them before. If you go back to 2018 in Orange County, there was a number of similar threats and issues that arose when we had congressional districts flip from red to blue. We received very similar public statements from local elected officials. So it's not just at the national level, it can certainly happen at the local level. We see that. And I will say this, it's not just in battleground states or contested contests, it is across the country. So while I think it certainly had an effect, I've seen it before.
Secretary Oliver?
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly agree with my colleague, Mr. Kelly. But as you noted in my introduction, I've been an election official at the local and state level now for almost 16 years. So of course, in every single election, we see rumors, we see mis and disinformation. Typically, once we as election officials are able to clarify any questions about how the election's conducted and provide the public or accusers with information, those rumors tend to peter out. Unfortunately, we are still on a daily basis in my state and across the country living with the reverberating effects of the big lie from 2020. The recent activities that happened in my state, where we almost failed to certify an entire county's worth of votes in a primary election, are a direct result of that rhetoric. And as we all know, when it comes to leadership, what you say from the very highest echelons of government power in this country do have those reverberating effects. And so, yes, Mr. Chairman, they are impactful, and they continue to be impactful on a daily basis in this work.
Ms. Howard, the DOJ task force, there's a DOJ task force aimed at confronting threats against election workers. It's received well over 1,000 reports of threats, but has only secured one conviction, which raises the question, why only one conviction? Is the issue one of law, that the law is insufficiently protective of election workers, or is it one of enforcement? What is your assessment of what's going on there?
So the DOJ task force has taken important steps, but clearly what they've done is not enough. We have a couple of recommendations specifically for the DOJ task force. We think that they need to expand the task force to include state and local law enforcement. As our Brennan Center survey showed, almost 9 out of 10 election officials who had been threatened reported those threats not to federal officials, but to their local law enforcement. DOJ needs to bring them to the table to help combat this serious threat.
And just before I conclude, do you think federal law is sufficiently protective of election workers?
I think there are improvements to be made.
Okay. I will now recognize the gentleman from New York, the ranking member, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I want to recognize Ms. Flores. We recognized her before she got here, but welcome to the committee and welcome to Congress. Mr. LaRose, I spoke in my opening statement at the end about my concern about the local election officials being able to digest the vast amount of election security information that they're given. And I want to ask you just briefly, can tell me what you think about what we can do to make that more digestible for the locals. The information is no good and the security directors are no good if the locals cannot digest it. So I wonder if you could comment on that for me a second.
Well, thank you so much, Ranking Member Katko. And, it kind of reminds me of my time in the military, where we had a saying that, what rolls downhill, because somebody's bright idea at the top ultimately comes down to a sergeant or a private that has to implement it. And oftentimes there's a lot that they have to deal with other than those kind of directions that are coming from a headquarters somewhere. We've tried to be knowledgeable about that when we deal with our county boards of elections. Now, of course, I issue directives. I have to do that in order to coordinate the way our county boards of elections operate. But it's important to remember that they are the folks on the ground doing the implementing of all of these things that you're telling them to do. And often that means that they're focused on a variety of different things. And so we also need to recognize that our boards of elections, at least in Ohio, and I'm sure this is the case around the country, reflect the great diversity of our country. I have boards of elections where it's 2 people that work in the courthouse basement. They're purposeful and dutiful about their work, but it's just them to run that county board of elections. I've got county boards of elections that are 150 people with a very large and sophisticated staff. And so it's important for us to remember the men and women on the ground, these bipartisan groups that are doing the work of running elections. We can't throw too much at them. We have to prioritize what really matters.
That I understand, but how do we fix it? I understand the problem.
Yeah, and again, it's us being mindful, right? It means that myself as a state administrator, the other 49 that do this work need to be knowledgeable about what we're telling them to do. But it also means that we need to be very careful. You all need to be very careful about not sending down directives or passing laws that would create federal standards that may be unattainable as well. One of the other things is far too many times the funding that comes is appreciated, but there are so many strings attached that the work that it takes to comply with all of the different standards attached to that funding make the dollars much less useful, because you spend so much time filling out the forms to justify how you're spending the dollars.
Thank you, Mr. LaRose. Ms. Howard?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. I would say that the concerns that you're raising are at the opposite end of the spectrum of the concerns when I was an election official, again in 2017, at the beginning of 2018, when we weren't receiving sufficient information.
Went from 0 to 60, right? Now we got to figure out how to digest
Exactly.
it, right?
So I think that federal officials and CISA officials in particular have recognized that they are trying to calibrate the amount and the quality of information that is being provided to our local election officials. CISA representatives at multiple meetings that I've attended with election officials proactively ask for feedback about, again, the quantity and quality of the content that they're receiving. I think CISA, this is an ongoing work is required, and CISA's working to do this. So they need to continue to listen to the election official community about what is helpful and what is not.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Oliver, I understand your testimony, and I credit your testimony about what generated some of the personal threats against election care workers, but I also appreciate the candid testimony of Mr. Kelly that it comes from a variety of different sources, not just one. And I think we need to keep that in mind going forward. Election security, I think, and a lot of the problems with election security are generated, it seems like to me, from the internet and the ability of cowards to hide behind the internet and foment discontent online, and then make that discontent actionable by nut jobs locally. And that's one of my concerns. And so if any of you want to address that, Mr. Kelly, maybe want to address how we can better try and find and anticipate the threats before they happen. That's finding the proverbial needle in a haystack. But what do you think, sir?
Thank you, Ranking Member Kako. I think it's a great question. And I will tell you that work that I've done with our local law enforcement fusion center in Orange County went a long way with that, because the intelligence gathering on the ground is really important. And identifying individuals on social media that might be spreading disinformation, misinformation, but not only that, may have represented potential signs that they could be triggered into some sort of violent act or something along the lines of threats. And I think that intelligence gathering is critical to reducing the risk up front.
Thank you. Go back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
I will now recognize the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Lancherman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you.
Very good. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. I want to thank our witnesses for their testimony today. As we all know, there's no such thing as perfect cybersecurity. I've said that many times myself, including in our election systems. As such, we should expect that vulnerabilities will continue to be discovered within our election infrastructure moving forward. Yet, amidst a climate of rampant disinformation and outrageous lies about election security, I do fear that responsible disclosure of and communication about cybersecurity vulnerabilities in election infrastructure is becoming more and more challenging. So not all vulnerabilities, of course, will be equal in their severity or ease of exploitation, but their very existence could be manipulated to undermine public confidence in the integrity of election infrastructure and, by consequence, the outcome of an election itself. So to all of our witnesses, my questions are, how are state and local election officials thinking about communicating to the public about cybersecurity vulnerabilities in election systems in a way that preserves trust in those systems? And also, how can elements of the federal government, such as CISA, lend their support? And are there opportunities here for congressional action to help address this challenge as well?
Well, Congressman, I'll start, I suppose, if I may. In Ohio, we were the first state in the country to implement what's called a vulnerability disclosure policy. Effectively, we were asking the good guys, the white hat hackers, to find wherever we had a vulnerability and let us know about it. That's resulted in dozens of fixes that we've made. We found where our errors were and we fixed them. One thing, though, that I've struggled with and have wanted maybe some more help from the federal government on is being able to share our successes. When things go wrong, the public generally will know about it pretty quickly. But we haven't always been able to share our successes, and the public should know when we had a day where the good guys won and the bad guys lost. Oftentimes that means as quickly as possible declassifying what can be declassified without, of course, jeopardizing sources or methods, but giving us the chance to tell the stories of where we stopped the bad guys is something I'd like to be able to do more of.
Thank you. Next witness.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, Member Langvin. I agree exactly with what my colleague from Ohio just said. I will say that when I first came into the Secretary of State's office in late 2016, obviously we had just gone through an election where many election officials across the country were not aware of what the federal government was aware of. And I think there's been a tremendous amount of work done working alongside CISA and DHS, the work that the Government Coordinating Council has done to try to figure out what is the right balance. Obviously, we want to be aware as soon as possible as chief election officials of any potential vulnerabilities. We want to address them immediately. We need that information yesterday, not tomorrow. I will say that I feel like the federal government has done a much better job about quickly declassifying or relaying appropriate directives to our offices. We're getting so much better about sharing that information with each other, but it is a delicate balance because we want to make sure once we've identified a vulnerability that we have a plan to fix it quickly, and that it is going to get the job done. And so a lot of the work we do is that very careful balance. We do need to make the public aware. That's incredibly important, but we also need to make sure we have those plans in place.
Thank you. And as a former Secretary of State myself, I understand the particular challenges that you all have. So thank you for the work you're doing. Let me shift to, since before my time has expired, Ms. Howard, if I could, in your testimony, you noted that despite federal efforts to make grant funding for programs such as Burn Justice Assistance Grant Program available for election security, none of these funds have yet been used for such purposes, and that election officials in at least one state have already had their request for Burn JAG funding denied. Could you and other witnesses with your insights here speak to some of the difficulties that election officials are experiencing in the application process for these grants? And, is there more the Department of Justice can do or other departments administrating the election security grants could do to help to get this money out? And if so, is there opportunity for congressional action here too?
Thank you for the question. Yes, there are now available to election officials are Homeland Grant Security Program funds. Just recently, the Department of Homeland Security reinstated election security as a priority. However, that prioritization was not accompanied with a minimum spend of those grants on election security. And what election officials are seeing and are concerned about is the fact that their needs are going to be deprioritized. These funds are not new, and many of the
Ms. Howard, I'm going to have to interrupt because we're 30 seconds over. I have to recognize the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Guest, for 5 minutes. I apologize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary LaRose, our Constitution, as you're well aware, gives individual states the rights to conduct their own elections. This is a central pillar of our government that federal authorities, I believe, must not infringe upon. And so my question, very broad in nature, is what can Congress do to make sure that we are providing a secure electoral system without direct interference from the federal government in a process that I believe that our founding fathers rightfully intended to be controlled at a local and state level?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I should say I enjoy working with your Secretary of State through our national association. You're right. There are 50 different ways of running elections throughout this country. That decentralized nature of the way we run elections is not a bug. It's a feature in the way that American elections are organized, and it goes back to our very founding. It must be protected. As you're well aware, though, the federal government has some resources that states just candidly do not have. And that's why I think that it's important to continue providing those resources. CISA is just one great example of that. I found it to be a very positive working relationship that we have with them. And then, to resist the temptation, of course, to tinker, for the federal government to start intervening and telling states how to run elections. I do think it's good for states to develop best practices and share those with other states. Candidly, I've worked to share some of the things that we do in Ohio so that other states can learn from them, because we've been under the national spotlight for many years in Ohio. But for the federal government to start mandating the way states run elections is a bridge too far, in my opinion. I would say humbly stick to helping us do our jobs better instead of telling us how to do them.
And Mr. Secretary, you do mention about federal mandates, and recently legislation introduced in the House, actually passed out of the House, and two of the things that were in that legislation as it relates to voting, two things that I find very troubling. One is it would do away with voter identification when individuals go to the polling place with an attempt to cast their votes, and would also require same-day voter registration. I know that Ohio is a state that does require advanced registration, as does my state of Mississippi, and also requires voters to present an ID when they are showing up and doing in-person voting. So can you talk just a little about the importance of having individuals make sure that they are registered at some period of time before the election, and then also the importance of voter ID in the integrity process as we're looking at making sure that elections are both fair and that individuals trust the outcome of those elections?
Well, yeah, thank you, Congressman. It's about finding that balance. I reject this notion, and some offer this idea that somehow you have to choose from either convenient elections or secure elections. I think that's a false choice. In Ohio, we have elections that are both convenient and secure. It is easy to vote, and it is hard to cheat in the Buckeye State. I know that's the case in many other states as well, but these are policies that we have developed that work in our state. That fit the makeup of our state, and it may not work in other states and other geographies. For example, as you mentioned, our state constitution requires people to register to vote 30 days before the election. I think it would be a very bad thing for the federal government to ignore what our state constitution says and mandate same-day voter registration, for example. Proving that a voter is who they say they are is an important thing, and we do that in Ohio through mandatory photo ID. If you don't have it, you can produce alternative forms of identification because we don't want to leave anyone out of the process, but we do want to know who voters are when they turn up to vote, and to make sure that they're actually registered voters. And so these are just important common sense safeguards. They work for Ohio, they work for Mississippi. If you don't like it in your state, then you work with your state legislature to make those changes. That's the best place to make election law, is at the state legislative level, and I think we should stick with that.
Thank you very much. Last question, Ms. Howard. I saw in your testimony, looked like on page 7 of your written testimony, you talk about the need for there to be funding for security upgrades on the homes of election workers. Kind of curious as to who that would include, possible funding mechanisms, costs that would be associated. Are you talking about election commissioners? Are you talking about poll workers? Who would be eligible for these home security upgrades?
Thank you so much for the question. As you heard earlier in Secretary Toulouse's opening remarks, she had to leave her home. I'm aware of other election officials who've had to leave their home, and I'm aware of election officials who have had local law enforcement do assessments of the physical security at their homes when they are under threat. Some of these election officials simply cannot afford to make the recommended security enhancements to their homes. I think that certainly that this should at minimum cover election officials, so the primary election officials at the local level responsible for administering our elections.
Thank you, Ms. Howard. I'm actually,
Thank you, Mr.
the gentleman's
Chairman.
time has
Yield
expired. I will now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Payne, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing, and to the ranking member, thank you very much. Mr. Kelly, you mentioned in your testimony that after 2016, DHS enhanced its relationships with the state and local election officials on cybersecurity, but there has not been as much engagement in the physical security. Has that changed since the 2020 election? And how can DHS better partner with state and local governments on physical security concerns and enhanced information sharing?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. I will say that I believe it certainly has improved. I want to give public props to DHS because I took advantage of their services that they had to offer. It's like a shopping cart of services. And that goes a long way to increasing the physical security of our buildings and the physical security of our vote centers. And I will say that I'm seeing more of that being done across the country by my colleagues than has been the case in 2016. And DHS continues to roll out additional products and services that I think are very valuable for use. So thank you.
Thank you. This were all the witnesses. In Ms. Howard's testimony, she explained that many election officials are leaving their positions because of their increase in threats, potentially leaving elections to be run by inexperienced workers. For all witness, can you elaborate on the value of experienced election workers in providing an efficient and secure election process, and what type of problems may occur if we are forced to rely on inexperienced workforce? How can we better retain election workers in today's environment? Anyone can start.
Well, Congressman, I'd be happy to start with that. We recognize, of course, how important experience is. In fact, what I did when I came into this office is created a mentorship program where new election officials, staff, members at the boards of elections can be partnered with someone from their party, from a similar size county board of elections, and benefit from their experience. So that mentorship has really been a great program in Ohio, and a lot of people are benefiting from it. But you're right. We have challenges recruiting and retaining election officials, those paid full-time staff. And it's not just,
yes.
Of course, that's a big deal, but it's beyond that. It's also just the burnout of the constant churn of the work that they're having to deal with.
Mr. Lowenthal votes aye. Mr. Gallagher.
Congressman, I would just add that I think as we continue to professionalize this industry, we're going to see additional retention as more election officials have resources that they can rely upon and feel that the people have their back. I think you're going to see more retention across the
Mr. Lynch
country.
votes no.
Sir, I would just also add.
Can you hold on for 1 second, Ms. Howard? Whoever, please mute if you are
Votes aye.
participating
Mr. Carvajal.
virtually. We need you to mute. I'm sorry, Ms. Howard.
Thank you, sir. I would also add that the typical election official, the typical local election official makes about $50,000 a year. And the reality is that these jobs, as Secretary LaRose hinted at, are unrelenting. Our election officials, unlike many of us, don't have the luxury of getting an extension, regardless of whether a child is having an important moment, a graduation, regardless of whether a loved one or themselves is sick. I will note that that Neil Kelly, who is also here today, in 2020 was in the hospital with COVID, and he continued working because there is no extension. There are no excuses when you're an election official. So I think that there are a lot of steps that we can take to help support them, fully staff their offices, and pay them for the work that they do.
Well, I thank the witnesses for those answers, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I will now recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to start off consistent with the spirit of this hearing and say, I think all elected officials and everybody in our country ought to condemn threats, and even to the part of what Ms. Howard read, even profane kind of vehemence directed against election officials and everybody else. I mean, we've seen in recent weeks it's same sort of invective and threats, and even an assassination attempt directed against the United States Supreme Court justices. And sometimes there seems to be some selectivity in terms of the way officials respond, and in fact, official responses. So we had the controversy last year with the Department of Justice issuing a memorandum about nationwide activity concerning threats against school board officials. It sort of turned out to be not so many threats, but even some harsh rhetoric. And yet, maybe we haven't seen that kind of reaction in the case of election officials, and perhaps we should. We shouldn't see officials confronted and condemned and hectored and so forth at restaurants. So I think that should be said across the board. Let me ask you, I guess, Ms. Howard, quickly, do you agree with that?
Yes, I think that political violence is a problem and that we should condemn threats against our election officials.
And other officials, wouldn't you agree?
Yes, sir.
Secretary Oliver, I noted a few weeks ago that the Wisconsin Supreme Court held that ballot drop boxes are illegal under that state's law. And you spoke about the reasons for distrust, and you attributed them to, you used the term big lie, and of course that has a lot of currency. But isn't it, I mean, there's no recourse for it, but isn't it true by implication that ballots cast in Wisconsin by absentee drop box deposited ballots were illegal in the 2020 election?
Congressman, thank you for the question. You know, I cannot speak to the ins and outs of the specific legality, the constitutional questions that came forth in Wisconsin. What I can tell you is that in states like mine, where we have secure 24-hour monitored systems that are permissible under state law, we do not see the level of concern and frankly, the alleged fraud that has been leveled against such ballot collection systems.
Right.
So I'm sorry, Mr.
It's sort of independent, Secretary Oliver, with whether it's legal or whether it's a good policy or a bad policy. And I'm not trying to attribute one or the other. I'm just trying to say there were a variety of things that contributed to an atmosphere of distrust about the election. One of which were allegations leveled that things were done illegally in certain places, and at least and I'm using the Wisconsin case as an example, that turns out to have been validated at least by a later holding by the Supreme Court, doesn't it?
Congressman, I think the challenge is that if we continue to litigate election law after an election has already been certified, after people have already been installed in office, I think this is one of the big challenges that we're dealing with. Now, whether Wisconsin can continue to use secure monitor containers or not, of course, is at the discretion of the Wisconsin Supreme Court and the lawmakers there in that state. It certainly doesn't affect, in retrospect, the outcome of the election and the certification of that election.
Well, I get you. I just think that the use of procedures that are illegal, executive officials improvising on the election law, which was a big part of the controversy in 2020, now you see, I mean, again, I agree. Once the election's done, there's no point in relitigating. I mean, you can't, literally can't. But the determination that it was illegal, I think, has some implications for people so I'm not sure you can then level against people who may comment on that subject responsibility for distrust in elections. It's a shared responsibility at worst. Let me ask quickly to Ms. Howard. In North Carolina, we've got a situation where the partisan Board of Elections, that is to say, we've got a partisan majority. Brennan Center, in fact, advocated for that when that was litigated in North Carolina, just voted 3-2 to kick the Green Party off the ballot. It's a Democrat-dominated board, and they did it over an issue concerning signatures, allegedly. But the same board recently said they refused to verify signatures on ballot applications. And I wonder, doesn't that sort of inconsistency breed distrust? And isn't a partisan board's partisan split rejection of a party from the ballot, doesn't that undermine trust in elections and elections officials?
Ms. Howard, time has expired, but please answer as concisely as you can.
Thank you for the question. I don't have the details about that vote or those actions, and I will talk to my colleagues that might be more familiar with it and get back to you with information.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Chairman, I'd like unanimous consent to submit an article from the Carolina Journal dated July 15, titled "Lawsuit Links Governor's Office to Effort Blocking Green Party from Ballot."
Without objection. I will now recognize the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Clark, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to everyone. And thanks to all of our witnesses for joining us today to discuss changing the election security landscape. Before I begin, I'd like to just offer my well wishes to our chairman and friend, the gentleman from Mississippi, Mr. Thompson. We wish him a speedy recovery, a full and complete recovery, and hope to see him soon. I thank the chairman and ranking member for calling this hearing to address threats against election officials and infrastructure. This is an issue that I myself and other members of this committee have raised for a number of years. And the importance of addressing this now has only been underscored by the excellent work done by the January 6th Select Committee. Protecting the safety of the folks responsible for carrying out our most sacred democratic processes, our local election officials and election workers, is of paramount importance. Recognizing this, CISA provides a number of voluntary physical security assessments and trainings that can help local election officials enhance their jurisdiction security. Secretary Toulouse Oliver and Mr. Kelly, how effective are CISA's programs on physical election security, and what additional assistance from CISA would be most beneficial to you and individuals in your capacity? And then finally, how can CISA's role be expanded to better help states and local governments strengthen their physical election security posture?
Thank you, Congresswoman. First and foremost, I just want to say that CISA and DHS have been absolutely incredible partners with election officials like me around the country for the last several years. Primarily, of course, for several years on the cybersecurity front, but here in my state, and I know in many other, if not most other states across the nation, we also take advantage of the physical security tools and resources that are provided to us. I think that, the very first piece of that puzzle is to conduct these assessments. We have been working together in my state, and I know many others have, to conduct those assessments, because without assessing the situation, we don't know exactly what we need in order to keep our poll workers safe and our voters safe out in the field, and our election officials as well. So I think, like everything we've been doing on the cybersecurity front and the physical security front, as we go through elections and as we continue to see what we need and what circumstances we are dealing with, CISA has been able to develop and adapt and improve those resources that are available to us. I don't have a specific recommendation at this point other than we should continue that work. CISA should continue that work in partnership with our offices. And as has already been mentioned today, funding is critical. Elections are critical national infrastructure, and a state like mine, it goes a very long way for us to be able to secure our election environment.
Very well. Mr. Kelly, anything you'd like to add?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I'll keep it brief. I agree definitely with what Secretary Oliver has said about the services. Just very quickly on the ground, I have a 200,000 square foot campus that I was responsible for in Orange County. And CISA DHS came in and did a very detailed assessment on that and identified dozens of areas where we could improve physical security. And the one thing that I would add is that improving from CISA the use of the same assessments for our vote centers and those that work in the vote centers would be very critical and important.
Thank you both. Ms. Howard, in your testimony, you called for Congress to fund efforts to develop and conduct online safety training. Can you elaborate on how you see this program operating?
So election officials' personal information is often available online. And there are consultants who can provide training and information about how to protect your personal information, how to protect against doxing. And there are services where they can go out and proactively assist the election official with pulling down and taking down that information and scrubbing it. There are a variety of steps that election officials can take, and putting together a training that provides a checklist for election officials just about common sense practices that they can implement on their own would be a step in the right direction.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I will now recognize the gentlewoman from Iowa, Ms. Miller Meeks.
Thank you, Chair Torres, and I thank all of our witnesses and ranking member for conducting this hearing. Iowa, over the past 4 years, has passed election integrity laws, and each time we've passed a law, we've seen record numbers of people show up at the polls to vote or to vote absentee after an absentee ballot request. So we're finding that people's confidence in the election system does affect their willingness to turn out to vote. So it's an extraordinarily important topic. Secretary LaRose, you recently confronted the challenge of non-government entities, the Voter Participation Center and the Center for Voter Information, spreading election misinformation in your state. The duo sent false, unsolicited mailings and confused voters. How are you combating this threat to your state's election?
Yeah, thank you so much, Congresswoman. The simple matter is that it's been done with information, getting accurate information out to the people of Ohio. But this concern first came to us from our county boards of elections in a bipartisan way. They were getting concerned phone calls from voters that said they were receiving multiple of these forms that were addressed to people that had not lived at that residence for many years or were deceased. So the real problem with these organizations is that they were using bad data. Of course, there's nothing wrong with getting voter registration forms out or with getting absentee ballot request forms out to make it easier for people to request their absentee ballot, which of course we allow in Ohio for any voter that wants to vote absentee. The problem was these organizations just did shoddy work, and it really confused voters. We've encouraged organizations like this, if they want to engage in some sort of a absentee ballot request drive or whatever else, work with us to make sure you've got good data and you're using the right kind of forms and that kind of thing.
Yes, certainly we know that voter rolls and voter lists are not clean to that point. It also appears that Ohio, like Iowa, is facing a shortage in election workers. One news article claimed that a county in your state has 551 workers but needs 846. Do you believe that this is a threat to your state's election integrity? And if so, what, if anything, can Congress or the federal government do to help states facing these challenges?
Yeah, thank you. And to the last question, we work really hard at maintaining accurate voter lists. These groups were using lists from years ago, and that was part of the real problem. Poll worker recruitment, it's like hygiene, like brushing your teeth. We've got to do it every day, right? And so this is something we've really focused on. I'm happy to report that for this unusual August 2nd primary that Ohio has to hold for our state legislative races, we're actually seeing strong numbers of poll worker recruiting. We've implemented all of these creative programs where we've worked with barbershops and beauty salons and the lawyers in the state to get continuing education credit, other professionals like realtors and librarians as well. So we've really worked hard on poll worker recruitment. The fact is you can't open 4,000 polling locations across the state of Ohio unless you've got 40,000 poll workers to staff them.
Thank you for that. And also after the 2016 election, and I think we've heard part of this already by some of the other witnesses, state and local officials felt frustrated by the lack of coordination from the federal government by not providing enough details regarding the Russian activity and how to respond. Learning from this, both CISA and the FBI changed their policies regarding incident notification and now notify chief state election officials when a cyber incident occurs in a locality in their state. Some have previously expressed the need for required reporting of election cyber incidents to CISA and the FBI. Can you briefly discuss why this may be necessary?
Yeah, we need to know things so that we can act quickly. And that's the bottom line, is when it comes to protecting our elections, time is of the essence. Elections occur on this routine schedule, and the next election is always just right around the corner, or we may even be in the midst of conducting an election. So time is always of the essence. I can tell you where CISA and FBI have vastly improved this is making sure that their state election officials, the secretaries of state in most cases, are immediately notified. If it's a county board of elections that has a vulnerability or a problem, of course that county board of elections needs to know, but we as their state partner also need to know immediately. Thankfully, those processes have been improved, but there's always room to continue to improve that. Again, a notification on a Friday night or a Saturday morning will result in action right then. We're not going to wait until everybody comes back to work on Monday morning, and that's why these things are so timely and crucial.
You know, we found the same thing in Iowa, and utilizing the resources CISA is providing to us, going to do a roundtable, which includes our election officials in it, as well as education and businesses. Thank you so much for your testimony. Thank you, Chair Torres. I yield back my time.
I will now recognize the gentlewoman from New Jersey, Ms. Watson-Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses. I want to follow up on Representative Miller Meek's question. What is it that first of all, let me just say to you, Mr. LaRose, I hope you're sharing information that has been successful for you all in Ohio with the rest of the secretaries of state around the country. I hope that you're connected in such a way that they benefit from some of this information, because it doesn't seem that you're experiencing the same kind of issues that we seem to be hearing about in other places. And so, Secretary of State Oliver, what do we need to do to be able to recruit poll workers, new election officers? How do we ensure them that they are going to be safe and supported? What is it the federal government needs to do to be able to help you all do what you need to do to ensure we have enough and we have the appropriate folks working either election day or even in, in the offices in general? And then I'd like to have Ms. Howard respond to that question as well.
Thank you, Congresswoman. First and foremost, Secretary LaRose is one of our most active partners at the national level. He and I are both very active in our National Association of Secretaries of State, which is recently has started to be helmed by your Secretary of State, Madam Congresswoman, which we're very excited about. We do share best practices with each other. But to your question, I think we've seen some signaling both from CISA, DHS, and our other federal law enforcement partners and the DOJ FBI task force that election officials at all levels, the security is a national priority. That needs to continue to be a drumbeat, and it needs to continue to get louder using all of the platforms that the federal government has available to it to make folks aware. In terms of recruitment, I think when I grew up, serving as a poll official, working the polls, that was a typically considered civic duty. A sense of volunteerism and community was instilled. And I think we've kind of gotten away from that. And I think the more we can do at all levels of government to send the message that being a part of the election process, particularly if you're somebody who has questions or concerns about the integrity of our election process, is a wonderful way not only to serve your community and to be a good public citizen, but it's also a way to make sure that our elections have integrity. So I'd love to see more public information by all the various platforms we have available to us.
Thank you. Ms. Howard, I particularly want to know about the resources that are necessary to ensure that the protections that need to exist locally, that they're available, that election workers and poll workers in particular recognize that there is this system that's got their back, and to what extent our local enforcement and state enforcement agencies are participating and recognizing the need to be engaged robustly, and particularly in this next election and preparing for the one after.
Thank you so much for the question, and I would highlight the Committee for Safe and Secure Elections, which is chaired by Neil Kelly and supported by the Brennan Center and other organizations that is working closely with state and local law enforcement and state and local election officials to address many of the concerns that you've highlighted. I will also say that election officials have reported, some of them have reported struggling to access some of the federal grant funds that are available for election security. So as we talked about earlier, the Homeland Security Grant Program, election security was recently reinstated as a priority area. However, unlike other priority areas, there is not a minimum spend on election security. It's a similar issue with the JAG burn funds, which are available to help better protect election officials. There is no minimum spend on election security. And what many election officials have reported is they are struggling to actually obtain access for a variety of reasons, including the timing of the grant cycle, the notification of when they are identified as a priority area, and other issues that, we believe that requiring a minimum for election security will alleviate many of those concerns and will help get the federal funding to the election officials that need it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I will now recognize the gentlewoman from Tennessee, Ms. Harshbarger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I do have a question for Secretary LaRose. I know that Ohio did a great job in 2020 with election integrity, but not every state did as well as Ohio, okay? I live in Tennessee, and I think we did a pretty good job. But you spoke about your Security Directive 3.0 to protect elections in Ohio. Could you explain this measure and how states could implement this in a successful manner to have secure elections?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much, Congresswoman. This built, of course, on our first and our second security directive. So this is just the third iteration in these checklists that we're giving. This one's a 31-point checklist that we're giving our county boards of elections. We're giving them a few months to get this done and bringing some funding to the table. What we did is put really strict new standards in place for vendors. Our election officials rely on a lot of vendors, and if they're not secure, then that could harm the integrity of our process as well. Stronger physical security requirements, working with DHS to do physical security audits. If you've got the best cybersecurity in the world, but your server closet is left propped open or unlocked, then that's not going to help you too much. Better vulnerability disclosure, and specifically requiring vulnerability disclosure for our vendors so that they can leverage the power of the private sector, of the ethical hackers out there to find where things are wrong. And then, of course, also prohibiting election equipment provided by foreign vendors that are on the restricted list that the federal government maintains. These are just some of the things that we're doing. You can talk about several other items as well, like better vulnerability scans that are being put in place, but those are the highlights.
Yeah, tell me about that vulnerability scan. I read that and I'm like, tell me how this works.
Yeah, so what we're doing now is requiring the boards of elections to let the vulnerability scanners inside the door. It's like a home inspection. If you are buying a new home and the home inspector can only look at the outside of the home, yeah, they're going to find a few things, a roof or whatever else. But if you actually let them into the basement, if you let them go up in the attic, that's when they're really going to find if the house is in good shape or not. And so this new vulnerability scan that we're requiring the boards of elections to do brings the folks that are doing those inside so they can get inside of the systems and really take a deeper look at what's going on in them.
Well, makes sense to me. I'd certainly want them to look in my basement or my attic if I had an issue with my home. Now, you talk about cybersecurity efforts, and can you tell me a little bit about what you're doing in Ohio? Because with that security directive, looks like you're requiring local elected officials to include, or election officials to include, cybersecurity terms in their contracts.
Absolutely, and that's how we enforce it with vendors, right? So when our boards of elections engage in a contract with a vendor, in many cases, these are boilerplate contracts that have been used for many years. We're now requiring them to include cybersecurity terms in that contract. And the simple fact is, if you can't abide by those terms, then you can't contract with the county board of elections in Ohio. You've got to be able to live up to the terms of that contract. So that's just another step that we're taking, again, to make sure that these vendors that our boards of elections are so reliant on can meet the cybersecurity standards that we've set for our boards.
You know, you hear about things, and I heard when I went to Nashville and talked to the legislators, I think the early part of the year, there was a problem in one of the counties with the Dominion machine that every 6th vote it kicked out, and they caught that because more people showed up to vote than there were votes. So, you know, there has to be measures in place in any state and in every county to make sure that there's no question about the integrity of any election. And, you know, that 31-point checklist, that's something I would like to take a look at, honestly. Make sure that we're doing that in Tennessee or anything that we can make do with and implement. I know that my county where I live in went to paper ballots this year, and you have to show your driver's license, paper ballot, it all has to match up. And, you know, that ensures safe elections, in my opinion. Okay, I thank you for that, and I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I will now recognize the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Stemmings.
Well, thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and to all of our witnesses, every one of you, thank you for your testimony today, but also thank you for what you are willing to do under what has grown to be unbelievable challenging circumstances. Thank you for protecting our democracy. I think we all know, or we should know, that regardless of what your home state is, that every person deserves to be able to cast their vote and have their vote counted. I've heard Mr. Kelly, I believe you said you're a former law enforcement officer, and I've also heard Mr. LaRose, you're a former Army Green Beret. We thank you for that service, but I certainly hope that's not the new criteria these days for election workers. Your testimony has been so valuable, but believe me, it's been quite painful. Mr. Kelly, you talked about that the level of threats, violent, crazy, unbelievable threats, has been amplified after 2020. As a 27-year law enforcement officer who certainly had an opportunity to interact with a lot of election workers, I have never heard the stories during my time that I've heard since 2020. You said the threats have been amplified. I think that's such a politically correct way of putting it. But I would like to hear from you again in that particular area, as well as every witness. Well, no, matter of fact, let me start. Ms. Oliver, amplified in 2020, but you've seen it before. That's what Mr. Kelly said, but you've seen it before. Could you just talk about a little bit what you've seen before 2020 compared to post 2020, please, ma'am?
Thank you, Congresswoman. So in my experience, again, in almost 16 years of conducting and overseeing elections, first of all, I think every elected official at every level in this country knows what it is to have someone harass you, make even general threats against you. Sometimes individuals, particularly those with mental health issues, get fixated on election officials. And from time to time, there are concerns about our personal safety. I don't know a single elected official that hasn't gone through something like that. However, in my personal experience, the level of vitriol, the specificity of threats, again, having my personal private information doxxed and having to fear for my own personal safety and the safety of my family at home during the holidays, those are things that I have never personally experienced in my role as an election official. So I would say it has been amplified significantly since 2020 in my personal experience.
Thank you so much. Mr. LaRose, thank you for the job you're doing in Ohio. Could you answer that question for me, please?
Yeah, Congresswoman, my experience is slightly more limited. I've only been the Secretary of State since 2019. You're right. There have been a lot of folks that have gotten too emotionally exercised about elections administration. I spoke to our election officials conference last year, and what I said to them is that, of course, elections are political. Every aspect of campaigning is, but elections administration must not be politicized. I think that should be our focus. The nuts and bolts of how we run elections and count the votes and report the results, let's stop politicizing that. Keep the politics for the campaigns.
Ms. Howard?
Thank you for the question. I served as an election official from 2014 to 2018, and I don't ever recall receiving a threat in that period just for doing my job. However, as you've heard from many election officials, that's just not the reality today. Many election officials across the country in red states, in blue states, in red counties, in blue counties, purple counties, are now receiving credible death threats.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly, I'll end with you. You also talked about that you're not advocating for armed officers, yet people are receiving threats to their families, their own personal safety, just for protecting our elections. Could you talk a little bit about what you are advocating in terms of working more closely with law enforcement to protect the integrity of our elections?
Thank you, Congresswoman, for the question, and I think it's a great one. I think that there's a couple of things that could be done. First of all, law enforcement in many cases is unaware that issues on election day or leading up to the election can be a real threat or real issue. Not in all cases, but in some. And I found that beat officers on the ground, just are not familiar with criminal codes for election violations, or that threats to election officials are occurring in large numbers. And so awareness is very critical. Very quickly, when I was in Orange County, I had police officers respond to some scenes, and they just thought it was a civil matter. They were not aware that there were actually criminal violations that occurred at a vote center. So making them aware.
Mr. Kelly, I'm going to actually have to the time has expired. I will now recognize for 5 minutes the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Flores, and welcome to the committee.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member, for holding this hearing today. Despite recent claims to the contrary, our country has record high of voter turnout. Given this, we must ensure those who are voting are legally permitted to and able to easily continue to do so. Our role in securing safe, fair, and free elections should be prioritized, making it easy to vote and hard to cheat. I want to thank all our poll watchers and all our election officials for all the work that they do. We must condemn all threats against our election officials. I know what it's like to be there, and I just can't imagine what they're going through, and I believe that we must provide them with the resources and the funds so they can do their job more effectively. Despite remarks by the administration implying that Hispanic Americans don't know how to use the internet and therefore are incapable of exercising their right to vote, I can speak firsthand about both willingness and the capacity of my community and the Hispanic community around the country to make their voices heard. Voter security, it is a national security, and I am thankful to all the witnesses for taking the time to speak with us here this morning. If I may ask, Mr. Kelly, thank you for being here this morning. Can you talk about the physical safety of election workers and officials specifically in Orange County?
Thank you very much for the question. And yes, ma'am, I absolutely can. I think vote center employees, as we call them in Orange County, or poll workers, the safety and security of them is paramount in what we do in every election. There are a number of things that we can do to increase the protections. For instance, plainclothes officers in the field ready to respond very quickly to incidents at polling places. Training that can help our vote center supervisors de-escalate issues is very important. But I can tell you that we were focused on security for those vote center locations and our poll workers and keeping them a priority because they are the backbone of how we operate. And it's very important that we protect them.
Thank you. Secretary LaRose, thank you for being here this morning. I know it has been talked about already this morning, but can you go further into details about the organizations such as the Voter Participation Center sending out false information in Ohio, and what steps is your office taking to stop this and other groups from spreading misinformation?
Yeah, thank you so much, Congresswoman. Appreciate the question. As I was starting to say earlier, it's really about public information. The voters deserve to know where their trusted source for elections information is. That's why we're constantly promoting. Go to the official .gov website that your Secretary of State or your County Board of Elections operates. In our case, it's voteohio.gov. That's where we want people to make sure that they're getting their trusted source of accurate information. But as it relates to false information in general, listen, the best antidote to lies is truth, and lots of it. And so we work to make sure that Ohioans have access to that accurate information. We partner with community organizations from the diverse communities throughout Ohio to make sure that we get accurate information out there. Social media is another one. And so these are all part of the efforts that really every Secretary of State engages in so that voters know how to vote and they know that they can trust their vote in the Buckeye State, at least. And that's something that we're proud of.
Thank you for your testimony. I yield my time back. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Malinowski, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all of our witnesses for the work that you do. I want to start with you, Mr. LaRose, and say at the outset, I was very impressed by your testimony and by the work that you are doing in Ohio to protect the physical integrity of our elections, but also then to defend the integrity of our elections against all of the misinformation that's out there. That said, it seems we've still got a very, very big problem in terms of public perception. When something like 40% of Americans believe that the 2020 election was stolen, about 60 to 70% of Republicans. I saw a poll that suggested in Ohio, 62% of Republican primary voters in 2022 believed that the 2020 election was stolen. I trust you agree with me that's a very dangerous phenomenon. I mean, if I were to believe that a presidential election were stolen, I would be losing faith in my democracy and the system of government in our country. Clearly, that is the root cause of the threats of violence that many nonpartisan election officials across the country are facing. So I guess my question for you is, what more needs to be done? What should elected officials, responsible leaders in our country be doing to address that false belief out there and to restore the confidence of all Americans in that our elections have integrity?
Well, thank you, Congressman. And you know, in some ways, I guess I find the silver lining to every cloud. The fact is that folks are interested in this topic right now at a level they wouldn't normally be. And so I view this as an opportunity to educate people about the safeguards that exist. And to make sure that that information is available in all parts of our state. I'll give you a couple examples. We've worked with our county boards of elections and had them set up booths at their county fair where people can come and vote on their favorite deep fried fair food or whatever. That's just the hook to get people to come over, because when they do, they'll see a voting machine and they may be inclined to say, well, hey, is this the one with the secret foreign algorithm in it? And instead of laughing at that person, it's a chance to engage with them and now teach them that voting machines are never connected to the internet. They're tested before each election, audited after each election, et cetera. We've worked with, again, the diverse communities from throughout the state to help empower those community leaders to be sources of accurate information about election integrity. And you know what? We've put out the challenge. If you believe that there are big problems in our elections, sign up to be a poll worker. Put your money where your mouth is. Spend the long day of doing this work. What we found is that when people do that, they come out of the experience saying, you know what? Elections are run honestly and reported accurately. Those are just a few ideas, and those are things that we're doing here in Ohio.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And you know, I'm sure you also agree, just very simply, all of us as public officials just need to tell the truth about our elections, because when we don't, it encourages our constituents to lose confidence. Ms. Oliver, you know, we've heard a lot about what happened in New Mexico. I assume that a lot of the lies and misinformation that led to those threats were spreading on the internet, on social media platforms. I often say that the big lie is the virus, but Facebook is the wind. And it's not just that these things appear on the internet, it's that the large online platforms do write these algorithms that basically connect every single person with a propensity to believe in conspiracy theories with conspiracy theories. If you're on the right, it'll push you further right. If you're on the left, it'll push you further left. These companies design their networks in a way that encourages the spread of information that makes us angry at each other, that increases our divisions from one another. So I see you nodding, so I assume something that you agree with. We are, a number of us are working in Congress on legislation that would hold these social media platforms more accountable for the way in which they amplify and recommend information to the American people to deal with these kinds of threats. Is that something that you think would be helpful?
Absolutely, Congressman. Thank you. I think that's a worthy effort. And I think, you know, just among my Secretary of State colleagues, you know, I think we all share that concern, right? Both the mis and disinformation from the right and the mis and disinformation from the left. And in fact, what we know for a fact, when we all started heavily engaging in this cybersecurity work about 5 years ago, was that, you know, foreign entities, particularly Russia, Iran, et cetera, were taking advantage of those divisions.
I'm going to have to interject. I apologize for. I want to recognize the gentleman from Texas for 5 minutes, Mr. Fluker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for your time today. Nothing is more important than a secure election with integrity. We are, and we should be setting the standard, the gold standard around the world. Secretary LaRose, you talked about how you stopped the perpetrator in 2021 and how that work really began in 2019 with good preparation. And I think that's key. So what actions are states or the federal government currently not taking right now that prevent us and protect any threats in the future, 2, 4, 5, 6 years from now?
Thank you, Congressman. Of course, the threat's constantly emerging. The bad guys are always coming up with creative new ways to do things, and that's why we can't. One step that all states should take, that we've taken in Ohio, is that your chief elections officer should have a CISO, a chief information security officer, somebody who focuses solely on that work of cybersecurity. You should have a vulnerability disclosure policy if you don't already. If there's a hole in your fence, you need to know about it, and the vulnerability disclosure policy is a way to do just that. Again, there are a lot of other things like Albert sensors that are available from our partners with DHS. If you don't have those at your county boards of elections, you should do that. That allows for that remote monitoring. So again, if something goes wrong on a Saturday morning or a Friday night in the middle of the weekend, you can know about it before everybody comes back to work on Monday, and you can mitigate the problem right then and there. Those are just a few of the steps. But again, it's about constantly monitoring emerging threats, and that's why our partnership with CISA is so crucial.
Well, thank you for taking those steps and ensuring that we do have faith in the system. And whether it's real or perceived, we have to get to a point where we have faith in our election system. Ms. Oliver, it's disturbing to read. Thank you for your 16 years of work. And it's really disturbing to hear your testimony, to read about the doxing, to hear about the threats. That should never happen. And we should all, as elected officials, and as was eloquently mentioned, condemn that. And I'm interested to hear, not just how that made you feel, but how does it make you feel to now see Supreme Court justices being doxxed and groups encouraging people to go to restaurants and intimidate those individuals?
Thank you, Congressman. Violence has no place in our democracy. Threats of violence and harassment are really undermine our democracy. And frankly, it doesn't matter which party, what level of public official. I think we're seeing this become more prevalent. And so that's deeply concerning, because as it becomes more prevalent, more individuals who may be inclined to engage in such behavior are looking at these examples and saying, well, if these folks are doing it, we should engage in that too. It might push folks over the edge to engage. It has no place in democracy, period, no matter who we're talking about.
You're right. It's very disturbing to see those that will not condemn those actions, that won't hold people accountable for trying to use the force, the threat of force, or any sort of intimidation, and disturbing to hear your testimony. Thank you very much. Mr. Kelly, I'm interested in your thoughts on, just the verification and knowing who is who, running a good election system, and understanding and how important it is to verify who's voting. Do you believe that it should be a requirement to verify those who are voting in your elections, and would you like to see that centralized at the federal level?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. Of course, I was operating under California law, which did not allow for identification to be presented in person. And so as an election official, I can kind of see the value in that, in terms of showing your ID, just like when you fly on an aircraft. Probably wouldn't be a bad idea to show at a polling place, but that's above my pay grade and a policy discussion that election officials shouldn't be making.
Well, Mr. Kelly, I think it's incumbent upon all of us. I mean, this is a good hearing for us to come together as experts in the field, you guys as experts, us asking the questions. But, I find it hard to believe. I mean, those that are getting into the Capitol today most likely have to provide an ID to get into the Capitol building to verify who they are. And yet in states, if we're not able to verify, I think your voice matters. And I would say it's actually, not above your pay grade. You are the expert in this and need to be, advocating for those policies. So I think I find it hard to look at some of the federal policies and proposals that are coming forward to say that we maybe don't need to have an ID. We don't need to show who we are. We don't need to prove that the system, and give what my colleague on the other side of the aisle just said, which is the perception of a good system that has integrity and character. I know I'm past my time, so thank you to all the witnesses. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I will now recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Meyer, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses who are here today. I think something that has come up in a lot of the questions and testimonies that public trust and confidence in our elections is essential. And I think what we also saw in the 2020 election that hinges strongly on having quick and accurate results. The longer it takes for results to be reported, the more time that is spent on that count. It allows the room for doubt, disinformation, and conspiracy theories to multiply that then further degrades public faith in our elections. Secretary LaRose, there are several steps that states can take to make sure those election results are reported quickly and accurately, including the pre-processing of absentee ballots, encouraging early in-person voting if someone is not present to vote in person on Election Day. Can you describe what steps Ohio has taken to make sure that your election results can be reported as quickly and accurately as possible? And are there other actions that you have taken to improve the timeliness and accuracy of election results?
Yeah, Congressman, thank you for the question. I wrote a mission statement on my Chief of Staff's dry erase summer of 2020, and I said when Ohioans go to bed on election night, they will know and they will believe the results of the 2020 presidential election. We accomplished both of those missions. It's about logistics and preparation. It's about making sure that you have the procedures in place to quickly tabulate, but to never sacrifice accuracy for speed. That's the balance that we've struck here in Ohio. And one of the reasons why we were able to report our results on election night is that we process our absentee ballots ahead of time. I know your state doesn't do that. Candidly, it's something that you all should look at because we don't count ballots until the polls are closed on election night, but we do process them ahead of time. We check the identification. Heck, even taking them out of their envelopes and flattening them out so they're ready to go through the scanner. That's a process that takes a while. And those are the kind of things that we do in Ohio to make sure that we can deliver those results on election night. Also, again, that decentralized nature of how this is done. It's done at 88 different county boards of elections, and making sure that they have the tools necessary to get that job done has been one of our top priorities.
I think the phrase in the Army for that would be slow is steady, smooth is fast. Did you
Very good. Yes, sir.
Did you have any issues establishing and implementing those processes? And as you look to other states and as you travel around, you talk to other secretaries of state, are other states well equipped or well suited to adopt similar best practices, or are there resource constraints along these lines that may require federal support?
The thing is, if you've seen the way one state runs elections, then you've seen the way one state runs elections, right? They're all different. And so a lot of those would require changes at the state level, but now is the time to do that well in advance of the next presidential election. And so if your state has laws that prevent the boards of elections from being able to process absentee ballots and get them ready to go and count them immediately as soon as the polls close, then that's something that you should look at. As far as constraints on resources, some of this stuff isn't expensive. I'll give you an example. In 2020, we directed our county boards of elections to consider spending some of their HAVA money or CARES Act money on a simple $1,000 machine that cuts open envelopes. Our rural boards have been using the old slicer to cut it open. Just a process improvement like a $1,000 envelope slicing machine can be a big improvement. But yes, federal support is important, and we've used it well here in Ohio.
And one last thing, when we're going into the 2020 elections in Michigan, and obviously with a large number of absentee ballots, there was, I'm not tracking how other states were dealing with this at the judicial level, but we temporarily had a judicial opinion that ballots could be received after the time polls closed, so long as they were postmarked, by the date of the election. Now, we've seen similar processes like that in California, in New York. We have colleagues here in the House who had to wait several months in order to learn whether or not they had won or lost their primary in some elections, or general election as well. Can you speak to just what you have seen I guess, if you could just remark on that. I know I have 30 seconds left, so we'd just love your quick thoughts.
Some of the worst things that happen in elections administration happen as a result of crisis opportunism at a court. The things that go wrong in elections generally aren't some sort of cloak and dagger secretive operation. It happens in the plain light of day in a courtroom, and those kind of last minute decisions are very problematic. Election law should be made at the state house, never at the courthouse.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Van Drew.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, and thank you for the witnesses for testifying today before committee. Ms. Howard, in your written testimony, you assert that the loss of election administration expertise and experience is likely to spur further disinformation. And use a Michigan county's mistakes in the 2020 election as an example of why having informed and knowledgeable election officials is so very crucial and very critical. I agree with you that in order for your people to have faith in elections and for our elections to occur smoothly, we need to have election officials who are willing and able to correctly do their jobs. It's important. I also believe that people need to have confidence in their technology and in their equipment that is used to count their votes. You made one mention of Dominion and these Dominion voting machines in your testimony, but did not elaborate on the distrust in those machines. It's important to ensure that election officials are using the very best technology available and possible. Just last month, CISA published a report which highlighted issues with Dominion's technology, with one concern being that the authentication mechanism used is susceptible to forgery. That's just unacceptable. We can't live with that. We need election integrity. In addition to having qualified election officials, do you think it's important to have machines and software that are secure and not susceptible to forgery? So that's my first question. My next question is, in my district, there were thousands upon thousands of people who received multiple ballots in the mail. Ballots for people who used to live at that residence. Ballots for people who had passed away. The list goes on and on. I'd like to know what you feel about that. New Jersey carelessly sent out millions of live ballots to people who did not request them, which rightfully caused great concern among South Jersey voters. It's no surprise that voters worry and wonder about the validity of voting. Do you think that states are sending out millions of unsolicited ballots, which are often drawn from outdated voter rolls? And do you think that in any way could possibly promote election security? So those are my two questions. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you so much for your questions. So first, I'll say that no system is 100% secure. In the election security sphere, we are all endeavoring to make our election systems more resilient. The three main prongs of the election security stool, if you will, are to have paper ballots, post-election audits where you actually go back and review those paper ballots, and solid cybersecurity practices across the board. So making sure that—
May I interrupt just for a second? I'm sorry to do that. When you say paper ballots, do you mean paper backup? Or do you mean that actually you prefer paper ballot system, period?
Paper ballot system, period.
Okay.
So,
and you're going to explain why.
So the voting on paper ballots ensures that in the event that there are any questions about the accuracy of elections, you can go back to the record that the voter voted on and check and confirm the accuracy of the outcome that's been reported. And you saw post-election audits conducted across the country after the 2020 election and again after the 2022 primaries, and you will see more and more audits conducted after the 2022 midterms. And so, to your second question, mistakes happen in elections. No election is perfect. However, election officials have a number of safeguards built into all of the processes and all of the cycles in our election system. So they have safeguards built into the voter registration process. They have safeguards built into the absentee ballot voting process. They have safeguards implemented in voting in person on election day. So even in the event of mistakes or errors, these safeguards are put into place to protect the integrity of our elections and to ensure that eligible voters can cast a ballot.
Real quick, I know I only have a couple seconds. The
I'm
shoot
sorry,
machines, the old machine.
The
My
gentleman's
time is up, okay.
Yeah,
Thank you very much.
Of course. I will now recognize the gentlewoman from Nevada, Ms. Titus, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to join all of you in wishing Chairman Benny Thompson a quick recovery. We miss him and we hope he's doing okay. You know, we've heard all the testimony and I agree with it that election security is a constantly evolving threat to our whole democratic process. The environment changes from one cycle to the next. In 2016, we were primarily concerned about Russian interference. Then in 2020, it was the former president's big lie that kind of was the biggest threat to elections. And now during the 2022, we need to look at what is in the political environment that could again threaten our elections. And I believe it's those domestic threats that are the most serious that we need to worry about. Last month, I wrote a letter to Secretary Mayorkas. Many of the members of this committee signed on to it to raise concerns about the increased threat environment as a result of the Supreme Court's decision to overturn the right to abortion. I cited an analysis from the Southern Nevada Counterterrorism Center that found that domestic violence extremists motivated by the heightened political environment could threaten our midterm elections. And the report predicted that the threats would increase against our election workers. In fact, in 2019, the number of attacks in the U.S. against abortion providers more than doubled. And I'm afraid that our elections will bear the brunt of that in the upcoming months, and that our election poll workers could be the targets as well. I would ask Secretary Oliver if he has taken any steps to protect elections in New Mexico against this heightened threat environment post Dobbs decision, and how this committee can work with DHS to kind of navigate this threatening environment for our elections as we move towards November.
Thank you, Congresswoman. We certainly are, and let me just say this. All of these potential threats that you just cited on the cyber front, resulting from continued unhappiness with the outcome of the 2020 election. In 2020, of course, we were dealing with civil unrest across the country leading into elections. And so, response to the Dobbs decision, potentially could see similar things. So yes, to answer your question, we very much are. We coordinate very closely with not only our federal law enforcement, but our state police and our local law enforcement partners. We meet with them regularly. We set up virtual situation rooms in the lead up to and on election day to monitor not just the cyber environment to ensure that it is secure, but the physical environment of our polling places and any place where voting activity or ballot processing activity is going on around the state. We continue to learn more, and so we continue to develop more tools and plans for how to deal with that more effectively as each election passes.
Well, it sounds like New Mexico's doing a good job. Some of the rest of us could learn from you establishing these best practices. Any one thing you could recommend that we ought to go home and talk about to our own state election departments?
One great thing that we're doing here in New Mexico, and I know some other states are doing this as well, is we've also formed a partnership with our New Mexico State Air National Guard. Their cyber task force comes and works on site with us during the election process as well. So we've added additional eyes and ears and expertise to monitor our cyber environment to ensure that that's safe. And it's been a wonderful partnership. I recommend it in every state.
Well, we'll certainly do that. Thank you so much. I yield back.
The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank our panelists for appearing before us today, virtually and in person. Mr. Chairman, election fraud is a reality throughout the history of modern man across the world. Fraud and criminal behavior is as old as mankind itself. It's as old as mankind's tendency to succumb to failure of spirit. We are failed and fallen since Adam, and our elections are no exception to that. I read a quote from a Politico article regarding a University of Pennsylvania research scholar immediately after a presidential election. He said, "How could this be?" He researched exit poll numbers that he was familiar with that had been reported on the night of the election. And he says he went down a rabbit hole of statistical analysis in search of explanations for the votes that seemed to have magically appeared. A week after the election, he shared a draft of his finding with his colleagues, scholars all, and the conclusion was that, I quote, "fraud was an unavoidable hypothesis," close quote. His analysis wound up spreading widely, drawing thousands of responses from around the country, people who believed, as he did, that the election had been stolen. It's a quote from a Politico article, but it's about the 2004 election with Bush and Kerry. This was a Democrat analyst. You understand, ladies and gentlemen, my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, election fraud and compromised elections is not new. It's as old as man itself. What's new now is the digital age. Nobody had an iPhone in the 2000 election. Bush and Al Gore, highly controversial. In 2004, there was no Facebook. Now we face a digital era where the theater of engagement has changed, and nowhere more so than in our sovereign state's responsibility to carry out solid elections every year that the American people can depend upon. So the real challenge right now is, how will our sovereign states present best models for dealing with the perception amongst the American citizenry that our elections lack integrity, that their votes won't count. This must be addressed at the state level. I, for one, do not support the federalization of our elections. We're a representative republic of sovereign states. This is a state's role. And therefore, the best practices of those states, amongst the sovereign states, that have provided solid, secure elections, cycle after cycle, this must be shared and encouraged amongst your state partners across the country. So I ask Secretary LaRose if you're prepared for a question, sir.
Yes.
As we saw with the 2020 election, due to the COVID pandemic, because Americans are concerned. It was quite convenient, the pandemic, mail-in ballots. And it certainly presented challenges state by state. How do we deal with this? Millions and millions and millions of mail ballots, mostly unrequested, some arguably outside the parameters of the law of that sovereign state wherein they were delivered. These are constitutional questions that will be settled ultimately in Article 3, adjudicated, and we'll learn from our challenges of the 2020 election cycle. But I ask you, Secretary LaRose, during the COVID pandemic, our country had to make a dramatic shift regarding how, or our country was forced to make a dramatic shift, found themselves making that choice on how to conduct elections. What were some lessons learned, sir, and how can that be shared with the rest of the country as we move towards this election cycle to encourage Americans that our elections are indeed secure and that actions have been embraced within the sovereign states to make certain that our elections are secure?
The time has expired, but you can answer the question concisely, please.
Yeah, I'll answer the question briefly. Resist the temptation for crisis opportunism. The way that your state has run elections has been put in place for a reason. Follow your state laws. Work with your state legislature to make changes if you need to. Don't allow the courts to make last minute changes in your elections, and mind the logistics. Pay attention to the nuts and bolts of getting ballots to people that should have them and getting them back. And not doing things that are sort of novel just because you're in a crisis.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I will now recognize the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to all of the witnesses. Let me be very clear of the importance of this hearing, and I will concisely take the ultimate reason, though over the years we have looked at the questions of voter registration, machines, cybersecurity, all important issues for this very focused committee on Homeland Security. But the real issue is in the aftermath of the 2020 elections, wrapped up in the big lie, and the continuation of the big lie is really the question of threats to the physical security of elections, with an increase in threats to elections officers and a heightened risk of officials acting improperly due to disinformation. That is simply what we are facing in our ability to really carry legitimate elections that are guided by, as the previous witness said, by the laws of the state, and not guided by misinformation, disinformation, and violence. That is what we're facing. I was appalled at the threats of the elections officials in Atlanta, in Georgia, in the last election, still unchecked today. I'm appalled at the state laws that have criminalized anyone trying to be a good Samaritan with a glass of water. So, Mr. Talise Oliver, let me ask you, as relates to election officials' protection, funding often does not reach its intended target. What is hindering those funds from reaching the election official? Mr. Oliver.
Congresswoman.
It's Madam Oliver. I'm sorry. Is it Secretary?
That's okay. I just want to make sure you met me. Yeah, Congresswoman, I think there's a couple of issues. I think first and foremost, one of the biggest challenges we have, for example, in my state, and I know many of my colleagues have shared similar concerns, because the funding that we've received so far, which by the way, we are incredibly grateful for, and I will never stop thanking you all for what you have allocated to the states to help in our work, because it has come sporadically in lump sum payments, and we don't necessarily know when or if there will be more funding coming. We've had to be extremely diligent and thoughtful about making those funds last as long as possible to sustain the programs that we've built around election security and cybersecurity. So often that means we are holding on to funds at the state level, waiting to see what we are going to continue to need in the future, because we can't necessarily count on that additional funding. And then, Madam Congresswoman, I know that some states, like my colleague in Minnesota, for example, when the federal funding is allocated, he then has to go through the approval of the state legislature. And that timing doesn't necessarily align for when those funds are allocated and when the secretary can then get a hold of them.
Thank you. I've got only a short period of time, so I see the logjam that we need to address. Let me ask Ms. Howard, again, on the question of election security and the attack on election workers. I think your testimony mentioned that election workers are simply leaving their positions. In my time as a public servant and going before the voters, it was an honor to be engaged in the election process. What are some of the things that we can do immediately to help fill these positions, as well as prevent more workers from leaving? I'm now in the midst of a Judiciary Committee hearing trying to ban assault weapons. I don't know with this rise in gun violence whether someone will think it's important for their position to come to a poll with a gun. What should we do, and how should the federal government be involved? I frankly believe we should be doing a lot more with persons on the ground. Ms. Howard, thank you for your work at the Brennan Center.
Thank you so much for the question. There are several things that Congress can do. So first, Congress can allocate funding specifically for training for election officials about how to, for their physical safety, and they can allocate funding so that election officials can enhance the security at their personal residences. Congress can also request that CISA provide specific training to election officials to protect their personal security. In addition, Congress can work with the multiple federal agencies and departments that are working to help protect our election officials to make sure that their efforts are effective.
I think, just very quickly then, in my 1 second that I have, let me just stick with Ms. Howard about the
I'm sorry.
constitutional problems.
Your time has expired, and we do have a number of people. So
I will submit it in writing. Thank you so very much. I yield back.
I want to be fair. I now recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Garbarino. Is Mr. Garbarino here?
Yeah, I'm online. Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member for holding this hearing. Mr. Secretary LaRose, I had a question for you. You talked briefly about your partnership with CISA, and in 2019, when Russia-connected individuals attempted to hack your state's system, is that where that relationship started with CISA, or did you have something going on before with them? And how did they help, or how did the federal government assist you after the attempted hack in 2019?
Yeah, I can tell you that I made it a priority from my first couple days in office to get to know my counterparts in other states, and we work closely with the cybersecurity teams in other states, as well as my partners at CISA, and then down to the county level. So it's about laterally and up and down. So we've been working with them ever since I came into office. But that partnership paid off, as you mentioned, when our state, like many other states, was the subject of what resulted in a ransomware attempt.
Okay, so with working with CISA, they are the head here Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, and now the election system has been declared as critical infrastructure. So their job is to protect it from cyber and physical threats. What services does CISA provide now that are most impactful? What are things that they could do better on? What's good and what's bad about your relationship with them?
Yeah, so first of all, information flow has gotten a lot better. At one point in time, it was kind of like we had to pull information out of them, and I can tell you that that's gotten better over time, and they've been purposeful about that. There's a whole variety of services that they offer down to a county level. I've actually required, as part of our security directives, that 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0 that I've put out, we've required our counties to engage in those services. One question is just one of resources, and sometimes there is a backlog in actually receiving those services. I know CISA's worked to address that, but if there was one helpful thing, it would be working to increase the resources at CISA so that those services can be delivered more quickly without the delay that currently exists.
So they're doing a good job. You just need to we just need to increase their funding so they can do it better.
The team at CISA is incredibly purposeful. From the director on down. In fact, she took the time to come visit us in Ohio personally just 2 weeks ago, and we appreciate the partnership with them.
Oh, great. Yeah, we have a very good working relationship with her, the director recently as well. So we think she's doing a great job over there. I appreciate that, Ms. LaRose. And I'm going to yield to my colleague, Mr. Pfluger from Texas. I know he had some more questions.
Thank you.
So I yield to Pfluger.
Thank you for the time. And nothing is more important than the integrity of our elections right now. And there is distrust in the American public. There is a distrust. And I remind my colleagues that, in fact, a former gubernatorial candidate in the state of Georgia still won't concede the election for governor there. So, the distrust here, and I'll focus my questions with Ms. Howard. You mentioned safeguards a number of times. Safeguards for elections to make sure that they're secure, to make sure that the public has the trust. So on the subject of identifications, IDs, would you say that the use of IDs to register, the use of IDs to actually vote and prove who you are, and the use of IDs to then match up when you're counting those votes would be a safeguard that would enhance that trust and the election integrity in all states? No, I understand that. I want to hear your take on safeguards, because you speak with great authority on this.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Thank you. Thank you for the question. I think whether or not a photo ID is critical depends upon the other safeguards that are in the system. You can't just look at one piece without.
Sure. So in states like New York or New Jersey where ballots can be mailed without actually requesting them, wouldn't that be a good safeguard to have, that the ID then matches up the person who is voting or a signature?
So in many states, the absentee ballot process requires that the voter sign the return envelope. Some states require an additional witness signature on there. So again, it depends on all the other safeguards that are in the process.
So would you say in your comment previously, you said all states have different takes on it. Are you for the federalization of our election system?
So I think that there have been important federal laws that protect the safeguard, that protect every every citizen's right to vote. So for instance, in HAVA, which was passed after the 2000 election, it included mandatory provisional ballots be offered to individuals that have issues at the polls on election day as a safeguard.
I think the safeguards that we need can be based around an ID that tells you who that person is, especially in states that don't have the signature requirement or that mail ballots to people who might not have asked for them. The American public deserves that. We have to have a system that has integrity and that we trust. And right now, there is a great distrust in our election system. Thank the gentleman from New York for yielding the time.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Clyde, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Clyde, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Torres. The safety and well-being of election administrators and a robust, secure election infrastructure is paramount to a functioning republic. In recent years, election security has become an even greater concern because of the radical changes and, quote, flexibilities that were allowed and attributed to COVID-19. For example, the Supreme Court in Pennsylvania ruled just weeks before a presidential election that ballots should be accepted as late as the Friday after Election Day, even ballots without a postmark. This was, of course, a direct encroachment on the authority of the Pennsylvania State Legislature, which enacted strong election integrity regulations and voter ID. And this certainly caused much confusion for election administrators and for the voters. This issue hits right at home with my constituents, as our very own Secretary of State unilaterally altered Georgia's statutory requirements requiring the authentication of absentee ballot signatures with an unlawful consent decree. Understandably, people are concerned with the administration of the 2020 elections because partisan officials bypassed the legislative process, effectively changing the rules of the game as the game was being played. According to the documentary 2000 Mules, thousands of ballots were illegally harvested by political operatives and placed into drop boxes in at least 5 states, which is a direct violation of state laws, which clearly say that you can only return ballots for immediate family members. To be sure, our local election administrators are not to blame for the poor decisions of some state elected officials that cast doubt on our election integrity. I applaud the efforts of election administrators, in spite of rapidly changing guidance, to administer elections in accordance with the Constitution and state laws, and I agree that their safety is paramount. Nevertheless, these constantly changing election laws from left-leaning judges amid a presidential election rightfully led to voters having questions and frustrations about the integrity of the elections. Strong election laws like Georgia's SB 202 will do a lot to ensure confidence in elections across the country. But hand recounts of paper ballots by local election officials would go a long way to further the confidence of concerned voters. In fact, I think that in my home state, every election should have an automatic 10% recount of random counties to act as an audit of the results. So, Ms. Howard, to your comment, I think that what you said about the need for election audits is absolutely correct. While I believe stronger election laws that restore confidence in our election process will reduce the threats of violence toward election officials, I believe that local law enforcement is the first and best line of defense for these types of threats. And we make sure that those who commit unlawful acts of violence are prosecuted at the state level. It's no secret that my Democrat colleagues have exploited these threats to justify a federal takeover of elections. Make no mistake, this hearing will be used as a platform by the Democrat majority to push for total federal control, like Mr. Sarbanes' Preventing Election Subversion Act of 2021. With that being said, I will direct my first question to Mr. LaRose. Mr. LaRose, as you know, the Democrats' so-called election subversion bill, H.R. 4064, would set forth burdensome requirements for federal elections. For example, it prevents meaningful poll observer access by mandating an 8-foot minimum distance in order to observe ballot counts across the country. I'm aware that there have been threats against election administrators in the state of Ohio. Is local law enforcement equipped to investigate and arrest the individuals who made these kind of threats, sir?
More than adequately equipped, Congressman. And in fact, we send a memo to all of our law enforcement partners before each election, making sure that they know not only the rights, but the responsibilities that they have to safeguard not only our poll workers, but voters, really everybody involved in the process. We've even gotten all of our elections officials to now be equipped with police radios through our state's MARCS system in the case of an emergency so that we can communicate directly with law enforcement.
So local law enforcement is more than adequately equipped to handle this. Next question. Yes. How would such a federal regulation imposing an 8-foot observer distance impact your constituents' confidence that the poll observer could do their work effectively?
Well, observation is crucial, but really what that is micromanagement. For somebody in Washington to think that they need to tell 88 county boards of elections in Ohio and how many hundreds of other county boards of elections across the country how far away observers should stand is the height of federal government arrogance, in my opinion.
Thank you. I believe that local control is best when it comes to things like this. Ms. Howard, as you may be aware, poll workers at a large polling center in Detroit, Michigan, blocked the windows with cardboard pizza boxes to bar observer access to the 2020 election. Do you believe it is appropriate for windows to be blocked so that the views of observers are obstructed?
Thank you for your question. I'm not familiar with the allegations about what happened in Detroit, but I will say in general there are laws in Michigan and many other states which allow for observers at various different processes, various different points of the election process. And those observers authorized under law should not be obstructed.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Thank you, and I yield back.
And I now recognize the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Kamick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very timely topic as we head into a very important election in this year's midterms. And I think it's something that we all have grave concerns about. Of course, election integrity is a driving issue. And I think as a fundamental right to go out and vote, we need to really ensure that people's ballots are being counted as they intend them to be counted when they are cast. And so I know folks across the country are really watching this, and members have been coming and going. So for our witnesses, I'm just going to ask a couple of questions to make sure that I understand exactly where y'all stand on this. So I'll start with Ms. Oliver. Do you believe that a government-issued ID complete with a photo should be required to vote? And this question will go to all witnesses, but I will start with Ms. Oliver.
Thank you, Congresswoman. We do not require that here in New Mexico. It is one option. And I think as many of the witnesses, excuse me?
How can you verify the identity of an individual without a photo ID that is government issued?
They are required to provide other identifiable information. Again, a photo ID is an option for voters. They can also provide other forms of documentary ID or give a verbal confirmation of personal private information to verify their identity.
That doesn't seem particularly secure, so we might want to work on that. Mr. Kelly.
I remind myself that I am retired, so I can give my personal opinion now. I don't believe it would be a bad thing to provide an ID to increase voter confidence. I don't know ultimately what problem it solves in some cases, but I don't think it would be a bad idea.
Okay, Ms. Howard.
I think that it's hard to look at one piece of the election.
Just a yes or no, ma'am. Do you believe that a government ID complete with a photo should be required to vote?
No.
And Mr. LaRose.
Congresswoman, the simple answer is yes, and most Americans believe that as well. And we should make sure everybody can get one easily and that we maintain accurate voter rolls.
Absolutely. I think it's very curious that of the 4 witnesses that we have here today, 3 have said in some form or fashion that no photo ID should be required to vote, that a verbal confirmation is all that is to suffice that a person is who they say they are. I mean, I can go out and say that I'm Jennifer Aniston, but that doesn't make me Jennifer Aniston as much as I would like it to be. So we need to, I think, one, if we're talking about this issue, start with the basic premise. of verification. You need to have a photo ID to cash a check. You need a photo ID to live life. We require driver's licenses with photos to drive a car. There are basic things that we have to do in life that require photo IDs. I don't think that this is discriminatory in any shape, way, form, or fashion. And I would love to see our local officials work to really make sure that it is as accessible and easy to get a government-issued ID complete with a photo so that we don't have these questions down the road. I'm going to go to my second question for the witnesses. Do you believe that third-party political organizations that are funded by political parties should be prohibited from signature verification? And I'll start with you, Mr. LaRose. Excuse me.
Yeah, in Ohio, that work of signature verification is done by sworn election officials from both parties and observed by the public if they wish to observe that. That's where signature verification should be done. That's how we do it in Ohio.
Excellent. Thank you, Mr. LaRose. Ms. Howard.
Thank you for the question. I think that Secretary LaRose brings up an important point. The signature verification procedures that I'm aware of are done by election officials, many of whom are sworn in and sworn to uphold the state and
But not in
federal
Georgia.
Constitution.
Mr. Kelly.
I believe in the exact same thing Secretary LaRose said.
Thank you. And Ms. Oliver.
I agree with Secretary LaRose, and I will just quickly add that in my state and many, we do allow political party observers of that process.
I appreciate that. For Ms. Oliver and Mr. LaRose, I am sure you all are aware of the ERIC system, the system that allows states to talk to each other. So if a person who is registered to vote in Florida passes away in Ohio, the two states can talk to each other to make sure that those voter rolls are updated. Do you believe that each state should employ the use of the ERIC system? And I'll start with you, Ms. Oliver.
Absolutely. We use it here and we encourage it everywhere.
Thank you. Mr. LaRose?
Great tool for fraud prevention and gives us a way to catch people that try to vote in multiple states. Even though that's rare, we can catch them now using ERIC. Every state should consider using it.
I appreciate it. My time has expired, so I will submit the remainder of my questions for the record. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Of course. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. LaTurner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. LaRose, thank you so much for being with us today. It's good to see you. I want to talk about a couple of things with you. First of all, the vulnerability disclosure policy. I'm interested in that. Could you talk about what that is and what that looks like and how it's implemented?
Yeah,
and congratulations on being the first state, by the way.
Well, thank you. And it was written up by a number of publications at the time because it was kind of a novel thing. I enjoyed being able to stand in front of groups in 2020 and say, I'm the guy that runs Ohio's elections, and I'm asking people to hack me. Now, of course, you'd get gasps and you'd have to then explain it to people. What I'm saying is the good guys and gals, the white hat or ethical hackers out there, sometimes they call themselves security researchers now, which is a more warm and fuzzy sounding thing. But the fact is there are folks out there that love to do this to find vulnerabilities. They're motivated by patriotic purposes to try to find where those vulnerabilities exist and to tell us about them. So you can see our vulnerability disclosure policy if you go to ohiosos.gov or voteohio.gov and go right to the bottom of our website. It says vulnerability disclosure policy. And if you click on that, it says, hey, good guy hackers, if you find something, tell us. Now, you can't vandalize our site. You can't cause some sort of a breach. But if you tell us, we'll not only fix the problem, but we'll recognize you. We had a great ethical hacker on our stage at our election officials conference, and we gave him a big award. And that's the kind of thing that other states should be doing as well.
I appreciate that. As you're aware, CIS offers a vulnerability disclosure policy platform to help federal agencies. Is this, in your opinion, something that CISA could engage in or should engage in with states and localities as well? Would that be helpful?
Congressman, anything we can do to encourage and even incentivize this is good. We work currently with a private sector provider that helps get the word out to the hacker community that, hey, listen, Ohio wants to use your expertise and will recognize you for your efforts. But to do that through CISA would be a great tool as well.
I read that in one of your counties, they have 551 workers but need 846 for the poll watchers. And I'm curious, how do you plan to close that gap? This is a problem that states across the country are having. And what do you think the potential implications are for election integrity and security?
Yeah, so we will close that gap, Congressman. It's something that we've been focused on really from the very beginning. You know, we've done creative things like recruit high school seniors through what we call the Youth at the Booth program. We've worked with my fellow veterans, asking them to answer a second call to duty, right, to continue fulfilling that oath that they took to preserve and protect the Constitution. We've worked with businesses, encouraging them to give their employees a day for democracy, give them a free day off, an uncharged day off to be poll workers. So those are the kind of things we're doing, but we're also holding our boards of elections accountable. The reason you know that number is because we publicly report it now. And so those county boards of elections that don't have enough poll workers, they get the scrutiny and the pressure to make sure they get there by election day.
It sounds like you're doing a lot of exciting things there. How many other states are implementing the vulnerability disclosure policy? Do you have any idea?
I believe it's in the single digits at this point, but it is growing.
Okay. And what about the ideas that you talked about, the youth in the booth and things like that? Are you sharing these in your professional organization or anything, so other states have the opportunity to benefit from your experience?
Yeah, for us, it's the National Association of Secretaries of State. My friend and colleague from New Mexico is an active participant and former president of that organization. We got together just a couple weeks ago in Baton Rouge, and we were exchanging ideas, and this is exactly what we do. So, yeah, we love to steal each other's good ideas, and hopefully my colleagues around the country steal some good ideas from Ohio.
I appreciate that. Mr. Kelly, during your tenure in Orange County, your department would produce an election security playbook in conjunction with state and local officials, in addition to the FBI and DHS. Can you talk more about this and the emphasis your office put on collaboration and partnerships? Because I think it's really key, as I talked about with Secretary LaRose, that we're all rowing in the same direction, that we're collaborating, we're sharing information, so that we can tackle this problem.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Congressman. Collaboration was a big part of what we did in Orange County. In fact, I partnered at the table with DHS, FBI, local, state officials, law enforcement, and we came up with a playbook and a design for responses on Election Day and leading up to Election Day. If you don't have that type of collaboration leading up to those important elements, you're going to have gaps. There's no question about it. And one other quick thing I would say as part of that playbook is doing things like list maintenance and increasing that list maintenance effort before ballots go out so that you can improve voter confidence. That's a big part of it.
I appreciate that. My time has expired, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. We are at the end of our hearing, but before I conclude, I do want to ask each witness, what's the most important action that we in Congress can take to fundamentally enhance election security? And I'll start with Secretary Oliver.
Thank you again, Mr. Chair, and thank you so much for having me here today. I think it's been a very important discussion, and I think that although we may share differing political views, I think there have been a lot of consistent threads throughout this conversation, and hopefully that gives you all and the American public increased confidence in our election process. Mr. Chairman, continue to support us as election officials in our states. I think many commenters today have noted the importance of allowing states and indeed the constitutional requirement to allow states to conduct elections. We do so many things in common to ensure the integrity of our elections, but continue to support us in our efforts, and particularly with, it doesn't have to be a lot, but ongoing funding so that we can protect our critical election infrastructure, which is a part of our national security infrastructure. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Kelly, what's the most important thing we can do in Congress?
Mr. Chairman, I echo Secretary Oliver's comments, and thank you very much for today's hearing. Two quick things. I believe funding is very important. Improving physical security at election offices will go a long way, and that assistance is badly needed. And then raising awareness on this issue. It is very important that not only the American public become aware of this, but also local law enforcement leaders and election officials across the country.
Ms. Howard?
Thank you so much for holding this hearing today. I think the most important thing that Congress can do is to provide additional funding for election officials and to require the currently available funding to have a minimum spend for election security.
Secretary LaRose?
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. We each have an important responsibility, from the county level election officials, state officials, to you all federal level. So I think that the first thing is allow us to do our jobs and don't try to do our jobs for us by setting the specific rules surrounding elections administration, but do support us with the great resources that you offer right now from CISA. Consider growing those resources. One additional thing is that voter list maintenance is probably one of the most important responsibilities we have. Maintaining that very dynamic list that's constantly changing is hard. The federal government has resources that are not always made available to the states as far as verifying citizenship data, death records, those kind of things. So more data flow as it relates to voter list maintenance would also be very helpful.
I thank the witnesses for their excellent testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the committee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask that you respond expeditiously in writing to those questions. The chair reminds members that the committee record will remain open for 10 business days. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.